Hey, welcome back to the Irresistible community. It's good to get back into the swing of things after a few weeks off. And I'm excited to get back into the text. Today I am sitting as usual in my office. It's one of my favorite places to be. I'm sitting here with my favorite Bible, and I'm doing one of my favorite things, and that is teaching. Because teaching is my spiritual gift. And I enjoy doing it. I believe that I enjoy doing it because it is my spiritual gift. And that's what we're going to be talking about today in Ephesians chapter 4. I want to go ahead and kind of give a little bit of background before we get right to Ephesians chapter 4. What we find is that in the first 3 chapters, since Ephesians is composed of 6 chapters, it's been divided up into 6 chapters, we see that right around the beginning of chapter 4, we're at the halfway point. And so Paul begins chapter 4 with the conjunction therefore, and so it's kind of like the first 3 chapters are kind of this highly developed argument that Paul is making, and then chapter 4 begins with therefore, which means it's kind of what we call a causal statement. Chapters 1 through 3 should cause certain actions and certain results. Because of what God has done in chapters 1 through 3, these are the anticipated results. And so I want to give a brief overview of chapters 1 through 3 and then launch us into chapter 4. Essentially, what we have seen is that God has chosen to incorporate Gentiles into his redemption story. But the truth of the matter is that God has always chosen Gentiles to be a part of his redemption story. We see that God chose Abraham, the forefather of our faith, out of a pagan country. And so, technically, Abraham was not even Jewish. He's descended from someone by the name of Eber, and that's how we eventually get the name Hebrew. And so Abraham and his descendants become known as the Hebrew people, and so God develops and calls forth a certain people group. And we see this beginning essentially in Genesis chapter 12, whenever God calls out to Abram and says, listen, I've called you out of your nation, out of your father's home, to make a nation out of you. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And you will bless all nations, or through you I will bless all nations. And so, beginning in the 12th chapter of the Bible, pretty early in the story, God begins to specify that he has plans for the nations. He has plans for the entire world. And we can kind of progress through the story, and we see that Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and Israel has 12 sons, and therefore there are 12 tribes of Israel, and these people grow into a large group of people. And we find at the beginning of Exodus that they've grown into such a large group of people that they've become a little bit intimidating, that they have actually become so populous that Egypt wants to take advantage of these all these people, and they would take them as slaves. And for 450 years, this group of people, these descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are slaves in Egypt. And we know the story of Moses and the story of Aaron, and how God calls Moses, who has been adopted by Pharaoh, to lead his people out of slavery into the promised land. And the story just continues. God chooses a certain plot of land that he wants to give his people, and so they become no longer monads. They're not people who are traveling around all over the place, but they are people who are designated according to a certain geographical location. And it's a pretty small piece of land, but this piece of land has been incredibly important throughout the course of history. So they choose to dwell there, and time after time they seem to either be kicked out and taken into exile or they're allowed to come back, but they're still, as Nehemiah says, they're slaves in their own land. And this is kind of the motif that runs throughout the entire Bible, even in the New Testament, is this idea of exile, that they've been taken out of their land, and even though they're brought back, they're in some form of exile. And a famous theologian by the name of N.T. Wright believes that this kind of ideology is even imposed upon the New Testament. And so this idea of exile is even within our New Testament theology, because it begins to move more into a spiritual idea, that we are in some kind of spiritual exile, and that Jesus has come to bring us home. And so there's a huge story with the nation of Israel, but one of the most important things that we can put together, even with the stories of Daniel and the lion's den, because they're in exile in that story, and even with one of the classic stories of David and fighting Goliath, this is a story about God choosing this puny little group of people to do great things with. And in a sense, David kind of just represents this entire group of people. And God says, hey, you know what would be really funny? I'm going to choose this little squirt to be the king of these people. And obviously, whenever anybody sees what's happening through this little guy and through this nation, they're going to know it's because of someone greater and more powerful. And so the story in the Old Testament revolves so much around a plot of ground and a certain genetic DNA of people known as the Hebrews or the Jews. These are God's covenant people, and we find that God has called them for a specific purpose. God hasn't just chosen them to just be nice. God has expressed love and kindness towards these people over and over again, but it's because He has an explicit purpose for them, and we find this throughout the Old Testament. One of the most clear references is in Isaiah chapter 42, and it says, "You will be a light to the Gentiles." And we find that what happens is that the nation of Israel fails to bless the nations as God promised He would through Abraham. And the Jewish people, they fail to be a light to the Gentiles. And so around the 1st century AD, maybe a little bit before, this little boy is born. And his name is Yeshua. We know him as Jesus. And he comes onto the scene as this prophet. And he begins to say, I am the light of the world. This is incredibly significant because we see over and over again that Israel has failed to be Israel. Their name means those who strive with God. They failed to be the people that God has called them to be. They failed to fulfill God's purpose to be a light to the nations. And so Jesus comes onto the scene, and He is the last and only faithful Jew. And of course, we don't believe that Jesus is some good guy who's pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, and he's just a good old boy from Israel who's done what God wanted him to do. No, Jesus is the Son of God. He's divine and He's human. And He came to complete God's story. He came to destroy death. He came to get rid of exile. And He died the most humiliating and excruciating death that was possible in that world and that time, and probably any time ever. Crucifixion would have been incredibly painful. But the story continues with the story of new creation, that God hasn't given up on His old creation, but that new creation begins with resurrection. And so through Jesus, the Messiah, the light of the world, the story kind of permeates throughout all the nations of God's goodness, of God's kindness, of God's generosity. So Jesus really is the light of the world. And so God's new covenant includes all people, not just ethnic Israel. And that's where we are. The church in chapters 1 through 3 includes Jews and Gentiles. And so Paul is saying, this is all that God has done for you. He's included you in the divine plan. He's saved you. And He's called you now to be a light to the world, to continue on as the hands and the feet of Jesus Christ. And he begins in chapter 4, verse 1 with, Therefore, I urge you, the prisoner of the Lord, I implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. Israel fell flat on their face whenever it came to walking worthily to the calling that God put upon them. And so Paul begins to explain what Jesus has done to give us these gifts. And he says in chapter 4, verses 4 through 8, he says, "There is one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." So you begin to see this repetition of one Lord, one faith, one baptism. "But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift." So each one, all those who believe, you and me, we have received a grace gift in order to function within the body of Christ, in order to demonstrate a life of worthiness. He says, "Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men." Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. And he gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. Now, what's going on here is we see that Paul is emphasizing what Jesus has done to give us these gifts. He's using a quotation from the Psalms whenever it says, "He ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men." This is kind of giving us imagery from military. Basically, this is what would happen is when a war or a battle would be won, that someone would come and they would collect all the booty, all the remnants of what was left, and they would take it back and they would give it away to their own people. And so Jesus has gone and he has fought the most extreme fight, and he's taken, this is my interpretation, he's taken all that was broken, all that was corrupt, all that was evil, and he's redeemed it. And he's giving it back to his people to use for the purpose of service. And I think there's an emphasis of all that Christ has gone through in order to give his people good gifts. And I'm sure that each and every one of you can think about a different time in your life that you received a gift. Maybe it wasn't the gift that you wanted. Maybe it wasn't necessarily a gift that you liked. But it was a gift from someone who you knew loved you deeply. And you began to learn of the story of how they obtained that gift and how they were able to give it to you. And there's a story. It's an old movie. It's an old Christmas movie. I'm sure that a lot of you have seen. But it's called The Gift of the Magi. And it's a story about a young couple who they have no money and they want to be able to give each other a good Christmas present. And so the man sees these hair clips that he wants to get for his wife, and the woman sees this chain or something like that she wants to give to her husband to put on his watch. And so she ends up cutting her hair to get the chain for his watch, and he ends up selling his watch to get her the hair clips. And they exchange it, and they laugh and they cry because they realize the sacrifices that each other made in order to give these good gifts to each other.